A lot of times people enter spaces as an ally without the understanding that intent and impact are two different things.
Mm.
So if I'm well intended and I mean well and I really want to help, that's enough without considering the impact that your presence may have,
Mm.
without considering the self-education that's required, without really understanding the full impact of your involvement.
This is Diversity Different with Demetria Frank and Daryl Jackson.
Welcome back to Diversity Different. We're here to talk about DEI with a little fun, a little depth, and a lot of truth.
Today we explore allyship in DEI, what it's meant historically and what it means today.
How can we move from performative allyship to real systemic change?
What does real allyship look like in DEI work?
Is allyship even the right word?
What are some of your best practices in allyship? Please let us know in the comments. What is allyship to you?
The main thing that I would think of first is that it's action. Allyship is action. So maybe we're starting with what it isn't versus what it is. And
Fair.
what it isn't merely a viewpoint, right? Like, I think a lot of the time we think because we have viewpoints that are aligned with a community or support of a community, we consider ourselves allies.
Mhm.
But if we aren't putting any action behind it, I don't think that is what social movements would call allyship.
I think that your emphasis about action is extremely important. And the way that I see that play out with this idea of allyship is these indigenous land quotes or statements that many groups want to make when they're on a place. And there's a wonderful skit where a lady steps in front of a stage before a performance and reads the indigenous land statement. And then somebody in the crowd goes, "Oh, so we're going to give all the money to indigenous peoples." No, 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 we need the money. Oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And the lady at the big front continues to refute that. No, 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 we're not going to do anything. We're just going to make this statement. And I think that goes to your point about what action are you taking? If you're going to be an ally, just saying the words is not being an ally. It's about the action that you do that follows. And this kid does a great job at highlighting that lack of action by many.
Then there's also the line of people who are more tolerant and who would consider themselves allies or aligned, but they have a but in how they think of the cause or the demographic. So I'm fine with gay marriage, but I'm not for trans rights, for example, something of that nature where there's these exceptions or the buts. And, I just think that if you have buts that are contrary to the community that you find yourself so-called in allyship with, that's not allyship if you have buts about something that's a part of that cause. I support Black Lives Matter, but I don't think anything about the police system should change. That's not allyship. I think that's kind of a conflict that comes up for a lot of people. And if it's not action, or if you have buts, you have a viewpoint, you don't have allyship.
I see this a lot in churches where folks want to say that they support gay relationships, but they don't want to see it in their church. They don't want their
Yeah.
pastors to be gay. And there's all these buts that the church has become very divided over because in this idea of Jesus loves everybody, but they can't be a part of our church.
Like, we support women's rights, but we don't want women in the pulpit.
Right there.
I think it's good to have a working definition of what it is. So let's get one of those out here. Allyship, in its ideal sense, is an ongoing, active, and intentional practice of using one's privilege, influence, and resources to advocate for and support marginalized communities in dismantling systemic oppression without centering oneself in the process. There's one definition. And I think it's important to note that allyship looks different for different causes and communities, and it requires continuous learning. I wanted to ask you if you had any well-known examples of what you think is good or effective allyship. Because last night I was trying to think about well-known good examples of allyship, and I was struggling, which may say something about allyship, right? And the problem I ran into was, like, every time I thought of a decent enough example. Women's suffrage movement, for example, there are some severe holes in what that looked like in terms of effectiveness and whether it was good for the group they were serving as an ally to.
I'm trying to decide if it's well known or not. But Tim Wise has been routinely good about letting folks know and saying when he's at these events that are usually corporate, a lot of money, a lot of white folks, he's been routinely famous for saying, the only reason you have me here is that I'm a white male and it makes you comfortable. And saying things like, I've seen the video where he said, there's African American men and African American women who have forgotten more than I will ever learn. And those are the voices that he's trying to convey to these audiences. And I think he suggests routinely that it's not his own voice, it's their voices. And I think that's part of being an ally.
Well, how good of him for saying that, but still taking the check. I'm just saying,
I
I don't know if that's effective because I feel like effective would be to tell them that when they call him and either bring the person that he thinks should be there or I don't know. That's just, I don't know.
That's a good discussion. So which would you rather have? All right. So if a company, let's just say company X says, look, we're either going to have Tim Wise or we're going to have nobody speaking about this. Which would you rather have?
I don't know, because I think it depends on the overall plan for that. I can't base it off of one talk. Or what else are we going to do with the money? Because is Tim Wise one discussion going to make a difference is part of my question. And Tim Wise, I'm sure, like most of these speakers on his level, they get big checks from those speaking engagements.
Absolutely.
I can't see him making less than $40,000 a speaking engagement.
I agree.
And so arguably, he's still capitalizing on the thing he's talking about.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to just stop right there because
I don't stop right there because
I don't know
think
the
this is a
answer to
really
that.
valuable discussion to allyship. This idea of if somebody, and we're using a corporation at this point, but it could be an educational institution, it could be a group of individuals, hell, it could be one individual. But if somebody can hear something far better coming from X, then they can hear that same something coming from Y. Is it better not for X to speak at all if X is saying something that Y knows better?
So you know how Home Depot, like if you go and buy like a paintbrush or something, there's like good, better, best.
Yes.
I would put that in the better, right? That he's there, he's saying all the right stuff. Is that best? No. That's just my opinion on it. When he gets that $40,000 check, does he follow up and say, okay, I said what I said about you only have me here because I'm a white dude. So why don't you bring in this black dude or this black woman or this Asian professional? So I don't know. I think it's better than nothing, but is it the best practice? Not if you're not opening the door for them to actually hear those voices with your agency, privilege, and power. So that's what I would ask. And I don't know enough about how he does that work in those speaking engagements to know. Maybe he has some alignment with others that he supports, brings, and then also saying, you need to pay him the same amount you paid me or pay her the same amount you paid me, then sure, if he's doing it that way.
I would love to get Tim Wise on the show. So if he's listening at all, Tim, get in touch with us and let us know so that, yeah, I saw you. You was wrong. You was wrong.
Yeah,
You
right?
so
Like,
wrong.
yeah, maybe like a year from now.
Him. Somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. It's like, yo, Tim, you should check this out. I just heard your name on this, right? So Tim
Yeah,
Wise,
go get
shout
us a
out.
check too while you at it, Tim. Like, just go get us a check too.
Break us off.
Good, better, best. Because you're doing a lot there, right? You also putting money in the Black community. You walking it like you talking. And I liken it to when I do work as an ally, when I do professional work, I'm not going to get up and be the person in front to talk about LGBT issues or do that part of the work. I'm going to bring in someone who's a part of that community and elevate them, their voice.
Right there.
Not because I couldn't go and research it and echo and parrot what essentially they would say. I know I can do that. But is that who they need to hear from? Is the experience different? Yeah. So if he's doing it, or anyone for that matter is doing it in that way where they're actually bringing in, and not just superficially, right? Because I think there is also, you bring in and you're not really working with that person, and there's little alignment beyond giving a name. Like, if you just throwing a name out there, oh yeah, this person, then I don't think that's it either. I think it's having a relationship with the communities that you're speaking from well enough to where they can come in the group that you're talking to, if it's training or whatever it is, that they see the alignment between the two conversations. So it's not even, to me, effective. So let me recategorize my good, better, best analogy. Him going is good because it's something. Better is elevating, lifting up other voices, bringing other people into the fold. Best is actually having worked with and doing it in a collaborative way so that there's a seamless understanding that you're developing for the audience. That's good, better, best to me. So to me, Tim Wise going, good. Yay. Okay, awesome. You got the basic paintbrush that's going to get it on the wall. So is it better than nothing? Which is what your question was. If it's that or nothing, yeah, it's good.
So instead of a well-known allyship example, I like the road you went down talking about how you've done it, because it seems like in your own work, you've brought in folks that you worked beside, not for, but beside. And that sounds like a prime example of allyship.
And I'm not going to say that I've done this perfectly either. There's sometimes when I've done it where I just give a name, and when I've been able to develop those deeper relationships, because it's something I know my clients are regularly requesting. Like, everyone wants the pronoun conversation or the LGBT 101, understanding trans rights. Those are the kinds of things. That part, I think I try to have someone that I have a really good relationship with, that I've seen their presentation. I know we use the same terminology or something really close, and so yeah. But do I have the same, for example, neurodivergent contact? I don't. But do I know people who do the work that I can place in front of folks? Yes. And so I'm not trying to put myself on this pedestal to say that I do it perfect every time, but I think I'm a better ally to LGBT rights than I am for those dealing with neurodivergency and probably even more broadly disability. But as a decent professional, I need to have voices that I can reach out to in any of those segments. And so that's something that I've tried to do. So am I always best? No. Here's the thing. With someone with Tim Wise's longevity, notoriety at this point, you have a responsibility, especially because you talk about the black-white dynamic so much, to have people you can call on from the communities that you're referencing. I think he has a responsibility to do that at this point. I don't go around talking about disability rights. I'm invisibly disabled, and that's not a big part of my talk. But if I was being edified for that, then at some point I need to start bringing in people who have neurodivergence, who aren't able-bodied, if I was making that a big part of my shtick. And I think Tim Wise makes that a big part of his shtick, so I would be really disappointed if his discussions didn't include amplifying other specific voices, not just saying you need to talk to Black people or you need to talk, amplifying specific voices that he know can do the work. That's what I want to know, whether he does that.
Tim, give us a call. We serious. We gonna bring this in, because I'm pretty sure I remember that he's done work with Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm almost positive I remember him doing things side by side with her.
Like, she's up there. I think he benefits more from her than she benefits from him. That's just, I'm gonna shut up
Good.
because let me stop. Let Tim do his
This
job.
is
Let
this is
Tim
good
do his
stuff.
job.
I think allyship has to be considered both on the individual and the communal level, right? So we've been talking about Tim Wise a little bit. And that's kind of the individual level. You don't always have a whole community around you, and you can still do allyship individually. And that's the work that we all are struggling to make sure that we're doing as best we can. And on the more communal level, I work with the Museum of Us, a museum in San Diego, and they, on a communal level, do a lot of work with indigenous groups regarding whether it's repatriation of artifacts or community activities. And the way that I see it on a more of a communal level is instead of a museum saying, we're going to do this for you, they bring the community, the people that they say they're working for, in. So they become part of the organization, the community. They are interwoven within so that it's not us doing for you. You are us, right? You are
Mhm,
us. And I think that's a big part of allyship. And I sense that's kind of what you're getting at with the Tim Wise discussion is it is no longer me doing for you. It's that interwovenness of it is us working together. And whatever privileges that I have, I am supporting you with because that
mhm,
privilege gives you access to something that that marginalization was keeping from you. And so I
mhm,
appreciate when I see that in individuals using their privilege, whether it's maleness, whether it's whiteness, or communities and organizations using that privilege, whether it's buildings and resources and opportunities and events. All of that is someone or something with a privilege saying, here, let me bring you in so that it's us having access to that privilege.
I think another way that we see allyship, modern allyship, where that is done well sometimes, if some of these organizations that have a lot of access in terms of resources, for example, Planned Parenthood, providing and sharing funding with reproductive justice organizations that center, for example, Black women's rights. I've heard of Black women led reproductive justice organizations, and they have lots of complaints against their white allies and how that work happens. One thing I hear from them constantly is that sometimes they're willing to share the funding, but then when it comes to the actual voice and the prioritization of issues, that's where they fall short. So they say they wanna bring Black women in, and they align with Black women. They may even share the funding, but when they get on the monthly call, it's like one Black group and 30 white reproductive justice, centered groups. And so the Black voice just kinda gets drowned out. And
Right,
so
right.
maybe even use your access, your privilege, because there is a certain amount of access and privilege being part of large multi organization is largely run by white women historically, like Planned Parenthood. They have a lot more agency in discussions that deal with reproductive justice than Black centered organizations, right? So I think the point that I was going to make was one, there are some ways that we can do this with resources. So if that looked like Planned Parenthood funding or putting money into some of these Black reproductive justice organizations, that's good. But is it better or best? Not
So
if when we get into yeah, we going back to our
we
analogy.
going back to that
But when we
paintbrushing. All right, all
yeah,
right,
but
all right.
so if we show up to the conversation, however, and you funded those organizations, but they have no voice, when they're on the bigger stages of conferences and centering actual issues, that's not better or best. It's good that you're sharing and funding, but is that the best way to do it? Probably not.
So you're coming from a place that you have some actual personal experience with this. So how ideally would you want to see this go down? And
So when I was working alongside reproductive justice organizations, these weren't clients. These so I wasn't really serving in a advisory capacity, but I think what they would say, because I think even as friends and even as co-advocates at times, I would hear the problems that they would have with these white led reproductive justice organizations. And one thing that they would say is this kind of bring up this issue of proximity, that because they had this physical, social, or professional proximity to marginalized communities, that they, yes, had a heightened awareness, and yes, um, understood the struggles more, the needs more. However, that proximity alone doesn't equate to allyship. It doesn't equate to being paired with the action that we're talking about before. So I think one thing that I heard a lot of was just that they think because they brought you to the table, they know, or that
Mm,
they get it, or that they fully understand it, which brings another point up about voice. So
mm,
you got the proximity, but you aren't amplifying the voice, or amplifying the voice in a way where it's on the level of the other voices that are being heard. So you've got 30 reproductive justice organizations at the table, and one or two of them are Black. The voice is just going to get drowned out. I think that they would say that proximity doesn't equal allyship. So just simply bringing people to the table isn't enough. Those are the quick things that I would say with regards to that movement specifically, and probably would be echoing the needs of a lot of groups that experience allyship like that.
I think that the 3 key takeaways that we're gonna get to at the end are probably tightly connected to what my definition of allyship is, and you nailed
Mhm,
it in one word, it's amplification. And I think that's
mhm,
the way that I see it, and I think about it on a regular basis is, am I amplifying? Because I'm very, very conscious of I do not speak for that group. I am not suggesting for a second that that group has not already spoken, and it's not about them saying, it's about somebody else hearing. And so my goal is as an ally for whatever group I'm working with, amplification. Are you amplifying? Not speaking for,
mhm.
not speaking instead of, you're amplifying. So, Demetria, we've been spending a lot of time talking about this word allyship, but that begs the question, is allyship even the right word? And what might be a better term to use instead of allyship?
So I'm gonna go with my analogy once again, good, better, best, right?
Mm,
So good is having a viewpoint consistent with a cause and maybe even some means of support. Allyship is better, right? That assumes some kind of use of privilege and resources to help advance a cause. But best, I think, is when we start to move from how we've traditionally thought of allyship to this idea of solidarity and ownership of the cause, right? So good, better, best. Good is, yeah, I support you in theory. My viewpoints are consistent. Better is actually allyship. And best is ownership, or at least in part ownership of the cause as own, not ownership as in co-opting.
mm,
Ownership as in this is just as much my issue as it is yours, because we have a shared responsibility to do better with things like women's issues, Black women's issues, racism, etc. So I think allyship is a perfectly fine entry point, but I think when we think of allyship for all of the things that we talked about earlier, all the problems that we articulated, those problems are usually present in allyship. But if we can start to build models of shared ownership and responsibility, I think we're less likely to run into some of those issues.
if we kind of track back on terms, DEI followed affirmative action followed civil rights, and each of the terms was really about this idea of equity and equality, right? That's what we
Mhm,
started off really shooting for. So the terms weren't so much the focus as the result. And so allyship to me is the same thing. It's a term that if it works fine, but really it's about what you ended that discussion with about ownership and solidarity. And I appreciate the nuances that you put behind that term ownership because it often sounds like, oh, we're going to own it. We're going to own it. We're
mhm,
going to take it from you. And you ain't have nothing to say because we owned it, right? Like that's a nuance that you articulated so nicely for folks that are trying to achieve that place, that good, better, best that looks like solidarity and ownership. And I'm wondering if you have any really prime examples that folks can turn to where they can say, oh, that's what real solidarity, that's what real cooperative ownership looked like or looks like. And that's what we should aspire to.
I think when we talk about allyship, we're thinking about helping, assisting, and we're not necessarily thinking about investing because with ownership comes investment.
Mm,
And I think that's important because the word ally can sometime imply that helper dynamic rather than looking at this as equal stakeholdership. And that reinforces the hierarchies, right? That if it's, for example, using our example today, white women serving as allies to Black women, when we come in it from a place of helping or assisting versus investment and amplification, then that reinforces the pre-existing hierarchies that get us in that situation in the first place by dominant groups. Um, Kind of these benevolent supporters rather than seeing themselves as individuals with a stake in the game. And yes, I agree with you that these are all just terms, but I think like the term allyship, what comes with that is just a certain way that we think about the work and the way that we think about equity work. Whereas if we kind of think about this as in this is just as much your cause because it's good for everyone as it is my cause, I think a different approach comes with that.
absolutely.
Um, and so the approach is what I think is important, no matter what we call it. And so we call it allyship and the approach is actual investment, if the approach is actual that amplification that we talked about earlier, if it's co-ownership, if it's not fostering saviors and a savior complex, then I think we're much closer to where we need to be, no matter what we call it.
I wonder how many folks actually grasp, understand, identify that statement you said about it's good for everybody. It's good for
Mm,
us too. It's good for all of us because it feels like a lot of this tension is
mm,
about I want all of the pie or at least most
mm.
of the pie.
Go
And
to pie. And bootstraps in that pie, right?
we only got one pie. And so, how much am I willing to give up my piece of the pie? And that goes back to George Jefferson and the Jeffersons. If y'all haven't seen the show The Jeffersons, y'all need to go watch the show The Jeffersons because he said, "Won't finally get my piece of the pie." And so to the extent that there is a pie at issue here, how much are people able to understand that it's good for all of us and how do you get them to understand that it's good for all of us and they are not losing their piece of the pie?
We use the civil rights movement as an example
Mhm, mhm,
that as Black people were fighting for civil rights, that led way to many other groups' rights, immigrants,
mhm, mhm,
disability right later on, right?
mhm.
And so if we're working on behalf of the most oppressed of us, then we're also working to service and help other groups in the greater good as well. And I think that's just something that we don't put in perspective. And it's just now that I'm starting to see people, especially on social media, talk about a lot of the other rights that have been gained since the civil rights movement as being kind of an outgrowth of that,
Yes,
right? The disabilities rights movement that happened
yes.
in the 90s, it wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for
Right,
the civil rights
right,
movement. And
right.
so I think as we think about this idea of shared ownership and solidarity, we have to think in those terms that if we are, for example, in the LGBT movement. So you got LGBT people who draw their line at trans rights, right? Like they
Mhm,
don't,
mhm.
I'm all about it until we get
Right.
to trans rights. And you have
But
people
that's the
in
but.
the
There's the but from
community,
before.
right? There's the but advances for trans rights will ultimately result in a better advancement for LGBT rights more generally. And so I think helping people see those connections to broader movements is helpful for the people that are open-minded, really wanna be allies, and really wanna understand. When we go into workplaces, we could say the same thing. That if we are trying to make our workplaces inclusive for the people who experience the most systemic oppression, that we're ultimately making those workplaces better for everyone. So use the example of in our teaching as we make our teaching more accessible to different kind
Mhm.
of learners, that helps everyone's learning, you know, auditory learners, visual learners, and the people who like to read directions, etc. If I got something for everyone, then that's helping everyone's learning. It's not just helping the audio person when I'm doing audio.
Do you have any key takeaways on effective DEI allyship?
So I think one thing that's been a theme in our conversation today, and it's really necessary for effective allyship, is having the cultural self awareness and humility to be an ally or to take on that shared responsibility if we want to start thinking about the language a little differently. The humility that it requires to be able to be corrected, having the self awareness to know how you enter a group and how you enter a cause and how you might be received by the people that are the subject of the cause or the group. Those are all necessary parts of self-awareness and the cultural self-awareness that's necessary to be an effective ally. That leads to things like being able to speak up in the right places, in the right spaces, and not just because you have something to say.
So I agree with everything you just said. And I guess in a short, sweet statement, check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? Like you need to walk into allyship, checking yourself. You need to think
Mm,
about what you're bringing in that are your own experiences or prejudices or biases or whatever that's not going to allow you to hear. And
mm,
maybe that goes back to the old adage, just listen first. Don't speak. Just don't. Just don't speak. Just listen, and the more you listen, the more you'll gain an understanding before you start to open your mouth and try and co-opt or own or direct where things should be or where they should go without a knowledge, without a base, without an understanding of that community that you say you want to be an ally to. My overall theme throughout this entire discussion is going to be the word amplify.
mhm,
An amplifier doesn't speak, it's not saying anything itself. And that's where people get caught up in, well, let me tell you how I think. Let me tell you
mhm.
what we should do. An amplifier doesn't speak, it enhances.
A lot of times people enter spaces as an ally without the understanding that intent and impact are two different things.
Mhm.
So if I'm well intended and I mean well and I really want to help, that's enough without considering the impact that your presence may have,
Mm,
without considering the self-education that's required, without really understanding the full impact of your involvement. And so I'm not saying don't be involved. We need
right,
allies. We want
right,
allies. We
right,
want a shared interest in the community of rights that we're seeking. We need that. However, intent and good intentions isn't enough. A lot of people
right.
made very big mistakes being well intended. And so when you say things like understanding your own biases,
Mhm,
if you don't,
mhm.
your impact may be more negative than it is positive, no matter what your intentions were.
So another key takeaway is educate yourself. This is this idea of before you go to any other group that you want to be an ally to, don't ask them to teach you. Don't ask to say, what do I need to know? What do I need to do? Sit down. Sit down with ChatGPT, sit down with Perplexity, sit down with Gemini and ask the first question. Well, what could I do to become a better
Mhm,
ally? Get resources, get the names of books, the names of articles, the names of authors, and then sit down and read and think about it. I'm not asking you to read every single thing out there, but after you synthesize some foundational knowledge, then go to a person and or a group and say, I've been reading this and here's what I'm thinking. That not only shows your commitment, both time and expense and resources, it shows a commitment that then shows humility. I've read, but I know I need to understand some more. So, can you help me think deeper? learn more, understand better, having shown them that you took the effort, you took the time on your own initiative to show real commitment to this endeavor.
Going back to the analogy of good, better, best, good is yes, getting to know everything about the topic. So, if, for example, in the wake of George Floyd, people were reading about police use of force and, kind of the history behind that. But a lot of times people fail to look at the broader subject of systemic oppression and power and privilege. And it's necessary to understand that in order to walk into a space and recognize and understand how you can amplify,
Right.
whether it's needed that you amplify, and also just an understanding of your place in the movement. You have
Mm,
to
mm.
understand power and privilege in order to recognize that. So that's the only thing that I would add is walk in there not only with the substantive knowledge of the movement or the cause, but also with the substantive knowledge of power structure and systems of oppression. So good is learning about the substantive knowledge around the movement itself. Better is learning about the power structures and how systemic oppression works. And then best would be understanding how to put those things into practice. In other words, how to leverage your privilege.
As long as they're thinking about the hierarchy as you've laid it out, hopefully that avoids them coming in with the savior syndrome, right? And I
Mhm.
know how to solve this problem for this community. Because if you go through the hierarchy that you just articulated, you can't do that. You can't walk in and be like, I can answer it because you haven't done the work that you just said is part of being good before you get to better, before you get to best. And I'm hoping that, and maybe this is selfish on my part, but I think a lot of people are like this, like they want a process. They just want a process. I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. Tell me a process. And I think you've articulated for them, this is a process. Maybe it's not the only process, but for those of you that are trying to figure out what to do and you want a process, here's a one step at a time process to getting to allyship, the highest level of allyship, right? The Valhalla of allyship.
The solidarity, like real true
Yes.
solidarity and co-ownership. And then the last thing that I would say in terms of effective DEI allyship is consistency and commitment. We talked about earlier how one of the benefits, if you want to call it that, of being an ally is the ability to put down the cause whenever you're ready. Once you're tired of doing racial justice work, if you're not a person of color, that's something you don't ever have to effectively deal with
Right.
again if you don't want
Right.
to. And
Yes.
sometimes, as we spoke about also, this can be a disservice to the cause itself. And so I think going into DEI allyship with this idea of shared ownership, which I think leads to that consistency and commitment that again, asking, why am I in this and for how long? Because if the answer is, I am in this because I saw a black man being choked to death on television and that made me feel bad today, or that made me feel guilty, then your how long is probably not going to be that long, right? As soon
Right.
as you feel
Right.
better about yourself, you out, or as soon
Right.
as it gets harder, as soon as you're fatigued.
Right.
But that's
Right.
why we're making and emphasizing this point about shared ownership. Because if you think about it as something that's relevant to your own community, if we can think
Right.
about this in terms of if we help the person that's most oppressed or most marginalized systemically, then we're helping everyone. I think we're more likely to have that sense of shared ownership and not drop the ball when it gets rough.
And for folks that want to go back and listen to earlier episodes, our consistency on this topic can be seen all the way back to the first episode, right? That's what we were telling the corporations is, are you in it for the long haul? And some of y'all vocally came out and said, we're not in it in the long haul. Like we are going to make a national statement that we are not in it for the long haul. And that's a second level of damage. One thing is to not be in it and just step out, but it's another thing to vocally state we are no longer in this. And if you're in it for others, are you in it for the long term? And for those organizations that made a national statement about not being in it anymore, you've answered the question loudly.
But I think they also have to be in it for self, because otherwise it's just gonna, even if we think about it in terms of Derek Bell. See, you keep bringing up Kimberly
And
Crenshaw,
you
and I
keep
keep
bringing
bringing
up
up
Derek
Derek.
Bell. Yep.
But interest conversion theory tells us they have to see it as being important for themselves, but not in the sense of I feel bad for myself, but in a sense of this is good for me and it's for me because it's good for everyone.
Convergence was an analysis that he wanted folks to understand. He did not want them to use it as a tool.
Mm.
He did not want you to find commonality, because as soon as folks don't want it anymore, you will lose it. And we've seen
Mhm.
this. We've seen this with affirmative action. We've seen this with DEI. And the entrance convergence problem is, once we're no longer interested in you, good luck. And we've seen them just disappearing into the wind. And
Mhm.
so he wanted folks to understand that's how things happen, not that that's how things should happen. And
Okay.
I want to be really particular about folks realizing that if you're relying on folks finding that commonality, they're going to shift on you at some point, and then you're going to be all alone again.
But I think commonality is different than shared responsibility too, right? Like
How so?
commonality is like Venn diagram. Like this is where we overlap. But I think what I'm asking you to do is take the whole circle as your
Mm,
own,
mm.
right?
I
So
like
there's a
this Venn
difference.
diagram. We got paintbrushes. We got Venn diagrams. Damn.
Yeah, I think that's the difference between allyship and the shared response. I think allyship stops almost at the commonalities. Because as soon as we're not aligned anymore, as you said, we're gonna do something else. It's over. But you got to see my whole circle and take it on. It's just as important to your. If not, you're not. It's fine. Just don't offer yourself up as an ally. And I don't think what we're saying is if you're not willing to take on the whole circle, don't do nothing. But what I am
Mm,
saying is maybe if you can't take on the whole circle, reconsider calling yourself an ally and how you show your support. And there's a difference. Then you can show
mm.
support without being an ally. So if Walmart, for example, they could have shown support, right? They could have made an announcement even and said, we're donating $4 million and stopped there. They didn't have to do shit else but donate $4 million and stop. They could have even announced it. But starting a center and all these other things they called themselves investing in, which was all performative, obviously, now we got an announcement that we're dipping. And so I don't think our messaging is that if you care, even if you just care today, that you shouldn't do anything, but I think you should
Mm.
just be very careful with how you proceed and how you support. So maybe what you want to do is support now, right? And monitor and see if there's something that you actually want to serve as an ally and be long-term commitment involved. When we court relationships, we don't know
Right?
necessarily that we
Right?
want to be in it for the long haul. So I
Right.
understand that. I understand that it might take you getting in it, doing the research, getting the thick of it, and making that investment before you know if
Yes.
you're in it for the long haul. But if you don't know that, then but if you don't know that, then maybe what you do is just support and not amplify yet, or not do these things that we consider allyship yet. I'm not saying walk away. Write your check.
Right? Right? Right?
Enroll, go to a few meetings, show up to the protest. All of those things are fine without calling yourself a full-blown ally, because the pullout is so much more damaging.
I hope you realize, like, you just lit it up. Like, that is a defining moment that I've never heard anybody else talk about, right? Like, you can be a supporter and not be an ally, right? Like, and there's a lot of people that I think they can it's an on off switch. Either you're an ally or you're not. And I think you really hit on something important that people need to understand. And I realized as you talked about that, that's what I am for some things, right?
Mm,
I'm
I'm a
not an ally.
supporter.
I'm a
A lot of
supporter, right? I
things.
send some checks, I do some things because I support what you're doing, but
It's
that ain't my
important, but
thing.
I'm not the one to do it.
Yes, you
And
killed it
that's
with that.
okay. I think
That's
that's
okay.
okay. That's okay. But the problem is that people want to get out in front of the camera and overstate their commitment. And that's how you get the performative thing. And I have no problem with people contributing in the ways that they're best suited. Because sometimes maybe it's putting people in touch with each other.
Right. Right.
Maybe it's sharing a resource. Maybe
Right.
it's alerting people of opportunities. No one's asking you to be an ally on day one. No one's asking you to have shared responsibility on day one. Maybe part of your education process is figuring that out. And that's another reason why that education process is so important. Is this something you got the stomach for long term?
Mm.
It's something that has to be answered in that conversation, right?
I am reeling in how powerful that statement you made. If you're not ready to be an ally, you can be a supporter, and that's okay. It's as simple as that, right? Like, and I think a lot of folks are going to find comfort in the, oh shit, I don't have to go all the way to become an ally. I can just be a supporter, and that's all right. The only thing I ask, don't be a parasite. We
Mm.
talk, don't be the damn parasite, sucking all the energy out of folks who are trying to do the work because you want the work done for free to embolden, embellish, highlight your own agenda, your own institution, your own group. That's the one thing I will lay down the law on, and don't be the parasite.
If you're calling yourself an ally, you have to understand that this requires active engagement, not performative support. You have to understand that this includes keeping your own house clean. You have to
Mhm.
understand that it includes fostering inclusive environments, democratizing knowledge, sharing resources and opportunities, and not centering self. If you're not prepared to do those things, then maybe you're just a supporter, and that's
And that's
fine. We
okay.
need allies. So I'm not trying to talk anyone out of allyship,
Right.
but in order for it to not be harmful, then we have to understand that it requires that consistency and commitment. And if I'm not ready for that, then maybe I'm just supporting.
That's the takeaway. To our audience, do you think that there's a difference between allyship, support, and shared responsibility? Let us know in the comments.
Until next time, we encourage you to think about diversity different.